Good morning and welcome everyone virtually to NC State and today's PNC Thought Leadership. This session will discuss the business challenges and lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Frank Buckless, Dean of the Poole College of Management. This is our fifth event in the PNC Thought Leadership. This series was created in partnership with PNC Bank as a way to bring together our collective minds and diverse experts to have conversations around relevant and timely business challenges to think and do. We thank PNC Bank for their support of this event. I would also like to offer a special welcome and thank you for our faculty, staff, and students, as well as our PNC team members. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brian Civarella, PNC Bank Executive Vice President, Corporate Bank Market Manager. Brian leads PNC's corporate banking team for Eastern Carolina, which delivers financial services to both private and public companies throughout the region. Brian is a great friend to NC State and the Poole College. Brian serves on our advisory board. As an advisory board member, Brian provides valuable industry insight to help Poole College understand what the local business community is looking for when recruiting student talent. Thank you again to PNC and Brian for your support of Poole College and NC State. I now will turn the program over to Brian Civarella.
Thank you, Dean Buckless, for that introduction, and I'd like to add my welcome to everyone here for our fifth PNC Thought Leadership Series in partnership with the Poole College of Management. As the official bank of NC State University, we aim to be a partner not only in banking needs, but also in how we support financial success among students through financial literacy programs, campus workshops on personal financial management, and through special events like the PNC Thought Leadership Series. The panel we have is uniquely qualified to discuss and add insight to today's topic, lessons learned, how COVID shaped business decision-making in 2020. In what better place to have this conversation than with the faculty, students, and guests of NC State, a leader in science, technology, business, engineering, and math. There's no question that COVID-19 has impacted businesses and transformed industries of all types. At PNC, for example, we've seen the pandemic accelerate trends in banking, particularly in the technology space. Today's panel will explore some of the business challenges that were caused, amplified, and accelerated by the pandemic. There is much to be learned and much to consider, and there's much to reflect on, like the resilience, agility, and compassion that organizations have demonstrated during the past year. A few things that stand out to me when I think about how our company addressed challenges, including urgently transitioning more than 1,000 local employees to a virtual work environment, registering thousands of PPP loans for NC businesses, and deploying critical grant funding to Triangle nonprofits. We hope this conversation will ignite new thinking and ideas, so we've allotted plenty of time following the panel discussion for questions and answers. Thank you again for being with us today. Now please welcome our moderator, Mark Beasley, Professor of Accounting and Director of the Enterprise Risk Management Institute. And our panelists, Rob Hanfield, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management, Glenn Sherrill, CEO of SteelFab, Stephanie Trunzo, Group Vice President and Transformation and Offerings for Oracle. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark to get us started.
Thank you, Brian and Frank, and thank you to all of the participants from joining in this morning for what I think is going to be an exciting discussion and insightful as well as exciting discussion about just lessons learned as we think 1 year later now, as we approach sort of what I think of the 1 year anniversary when the ACC tournament got canceled. As we think about just the year that we've lived through, I think it's helpful to always sort of step back and think about what are some of the lessons learned. And so that'll be our theme for today as we think about this conversation about lessons that have been learned from the perspectives of our panelists. So as Brian mentioned, we have an awesome group here that I think is going to provide some interesting perspectives from different angles. And I'm pleased again to introduce Rob Hanfield, who again is a colleague of mine here, a professor Executive Director of our Supply Chain Resource Cooperative, and he's the Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Operations Supply Chain Management. Glenn Sherrill, as Brian mentioned, is CEO of StillFab Inc. And then Stephanie Trunzo, who's Group VP of Transformation and Offerings, leading strategic initiatives there at Oracle. So again, I want to say welcome and thank you to Rob, Glenn, and Stephanie for joining us this morning. But just to give the participants a little more perspective about your background, I've asked each of you just to tell us a little bit more about what you do in your day-to-day world, just beyond the bio part that Brian and I just touched on. So Rob, can I turn to you first, just to provide a little more perspective of some of the work you're doing, particularly through the Supply Chain Cooperative, and then even more so what you're doing related to the COVID vaccine distribution and that kind of thing.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone here today on this panel. So yeah, I was the founder of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative, which is a center for engaging with industry on thought leadership and knowledge creation, using student teams really as the primary vehicle for creation of that knowledge. We've been quite involved with all of the COVID-related activities in terms of my blog. We've had several webinars on the COVID response and the COVID vaccine. And a lot of my work has been involved initially starting back in the early days of the beginning of the COVID crisis. I was involved, asked to join the Joint Acquisition Task Force, which was a team led by the U.S. Air Force to try to identify sources of PPE and other shortages that were occurring all over the country. And so I was quite involved with that group. We had a lot of discussions with FEMA, with DHS. I was also doing interviews with each of the chief procurement officers for every state in the country as part of a study we did with NASPO. So I was really immersed in a lot of the response to COVID during this time period, and continue to be engaged with the state, helping them with the vaccine deployment, and also working most recently with CEPI, which is a coalition for epidemic preparedness, on helping them to think through how to deploy vaccines globally as well. So excited to be here this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for all that work you're doing related to the vaccine and all the PPE work. Glenn, so tell us a little bit more about StillFab and your work there, and sort of what the reach of StillFab is in that particular industry.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So as Mark said, I'm the chairman and CEO of StillFab. We are a third generation family-owned steel construction company. So what that means is we buy structural steel from U.S. domestic mills. We bring it into our plants. We saw it to length, we fabricate it, we weld the connection parts on, we paint the steel if it needs to be painted, and then we erect it in the field. So we build the steel frames for large commercial buildings. That would be hospitals, power plants, warehouses, office towers. And so when the pandemic hit, what we were focused on the first 30 days was, are the governors of all the states that we do business in, and we do business in 27 states, we have 11 plants spread throughout the United States, are the governors going to follow what Pennsylvania did and what Oregon did and what California did, which was shut all the job sites down? So for the most part, we dodged a bullet there, but we did have a number of job sites shut down during that first month in April 20.
And again, you said you're in how many states? 20?
Well, we have 11 plants, but we do business in 27 states.
Okay, great. Stephanie, tell us about some of your experience of work at Oracle and what you do there.
Yeah, sure. Hi. So I run a team that's called Strategy and Transformation. And so given that my role is focused on thinking about how do we not only transform ourselves, Oracle, as a technology company, but transform our clients as well. It's been a really fascinating year to be in a job that's focused on transformation.
Really?
So what mainly I'm doing is looking at how do we take technology like cloud technology and cognitive and AI and data-driven technology and use it to help our clients achieve their business outcomes. And a lot of that this year has been about shifting to accelerate their digitization of their business or getting creative in taking new product to market in an entirely different way. So it's been a really informative year in thinking about how we not just take kind of a typical approach to looking at applying technology, but really shifting the dynamics culturally as well.
Yeah, so that word transformation in your title, it's probably all caps this past year.
Yeah, a lot of change.
Transformative, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's great. Thank y'all for being here again. And I think we have an interesting perspective. Rob has the lens on looking at a number of industries and entities across the U.S. as he does the work through the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative. Glenn's leading a company that provides a very tangible steel product. And Stephanie is in a company that's more in a solutions from a technology perspective in the cloud. So a very different kind of approach to the marketplace. And I think that perspective is going to be really helpful. So for our participants today, what we're going to do is center our conversation around 5 lessons learned that we're going to tee up our conversation to sort of address some of the takeaways that we can all gather from our experience collectively over the past year. And so we'll be touching on a number of lessons as we go through this morning, but I want to encourage you to submit a question through the Q&A function that you'll see on the bottom of your screen. We'll save some time toward the end to get into a Q&A conversation, but I wanted to at least alert you to that opportunity for you. So if you have a question, send them that way. We'll try to monitor some of those. Well, let's start out with our first lesson. The first lesson is I wanted to really just start with a really big picture. The lesson being, let's make sure we recognize sort of what we wish we had known a year ago today. So one lesson is, what do I wish I had known that I didn't really, as we entered into this experience a year ago, March. And so I'd like to sort of take the benefit of hindsight and think about what is it you wish you had known, but didn't quite realize a year ago. And if you could unwind the clock, what would you do, or what would you like to have known at that point? And Stephanie, can I start with you on that? Just any thoughts that you have about what I wish I had known?
Yeah, and hindsight is fascinating, isn't it? It's you only ever know what you know in the moment. So I guess I would give maybe 2 thoughts. One, buy more sweatpants. Right? So that's a good lesson I think we all learned. But seriously, I think one of the things looking back that I would say is the ability for organizations to prioritize learning to be flexible. Mm-hmm. And not just a specific takeaway, but really building that into the cultural mentality. Like, how rapidly can you make turns and pivots in your organization? Are you built for innovation? Are you built for speed and agility? And that's not just a technology statement. It's a statement kind of about how the organizational culture operates. Mm-hmm. Are you really wedded to process in a way that's going to make it difficult for you to make rapid changes? I mean, even something sort of as simple as, can a company that is a distillery rapidly turn to start making hand sanitizer? I mean, these are simple examples, but it's more about the cultural adaptivity of an organization. So I think that's one of the lessons that, looking backwards, every organization, whether they are focused on technology or not, can kind of examine internally is how quickly can they adapt to a change they didn't expect.
It's interesting. You talked about that resistance to change. We recently released some research on top risk on the minds of executives for 2021. Number 10 was resistance to change, a fear of that.
Yes.
You hit it, what is on the minds of a lot of people concerned about that. Glenn, tell us about just sort of when you think back a year ago, what do you wish you had known that you now sort of know that would have been helpful?
Yeah, well, Mark, the list is long. I'd start with market. I was in this camp, and part of it was influenced because I'm a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and we had a board meeting in March, and it was doom and gloom. as in the economy is going to totally shut down for the next 60 days, and this will be unprecedented. Then we roll into my business, Steel Fam. One of the keys, one of the kind of the real keys to business clearly is you got to have cash. If you don't have cash, you can't make payroll. If you can't make payroll, you can't stay in business. So when we rolled into about March 21st, the governor of Pennsylvania shut every job site down that was not, quote, deemed essential. We were fortunate. We only had 2 job sites in Pennsylvania. Then the governor of Oregon followed suit. Then the governor of California followed suit. So then the governor of Washington State followed suit. And we have a plant in south of Portland, Oregon. So we started to look up. Within a week, we had about 8 job sites that had been shut down. And what that means in layman's terms for a company like us, if we cannot deliver the steel and erect the steel, we can't bill for it. We can't bill for it, we don't get paid. You don't get paid, you run out of cash. You run out of cash, you go out of business. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. So at that point, I immediately went to our primary lender, Wells Fargo, and asked for an extension on our line of credit. Give you a kind of order of magnitude for those who are listening. We have a $100 million line of credit. We asked for 20 million. They said, no problem. Let us know in a week or so. I called back in a week or so and they said, you better go now. Every company that's your size that we do business with is asking for 20 to 40% increases on their line of credit. So we paid for it. It's about $50,000 bill. We got the line of credit extended. I worked every angle I could work in terms of politics, calling Governor Cooper, those sorts of things, trying to get through to him. And we dodged a big bullet. 30% of our revenues in North Carolina, Governor Cooper ultimately didn't shut the job sites down. And turned out we didn't need that additional liquidity, but it helped me sleep better at night. And I would, the other thing I would say on the things that, we wish we had known, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what our steel price is going to do. Well, of course, you go back to what happened in 2008. And in 2008, steel prices collapsed. Fall of 2008, financial crisis hits. Steel prices dropped 50% in 60 days. And so we assumed there'd be a drop. We knew it wouldn't drop 50% because steel prices were already fairly low. And what happened was really fascinating. The products that we buy dropped about $50 a ton in April. And then by September, that number had recovered. And then from September 1st through today, most of the products we buy are up anywhere from 40 to 100%. So there's been an unbelievable amount of escalation in our industry. So, and it's all pandemic driven. And so, the opposite of what we thought was going to happen actually happened. And I'll stop there.
Wow. One of the lessons learned is it's hard to sleep at night at times in your shoes, for sure. Rob, you're looking at it from a multi-industry perspective and talking to all kinds of, particularly you talked about the procurement side. What's sort of your takeaway of, gosh, what do I wish we had known a year ago?
Well, it's kind of funny, Mark. In 2010, I did a study for the IBM Business of Government. It was called Planning for the Inevitable, the role of the federal supply chain in preparing for national emergencies. And I got to say, I think that study gained a lot of dust and didn't get read by a lot of people in the administration or in the state. And I've shown a link to it. But I think really what I think people did not realize is just how dependent that we are on the global supply chain and really not understanding, who is in that supply chain and where those linkages are, not just one tier back, but several tiers back. And so, what happened was completely unprecedented. I mean, you had every country in the world essentially shut down their borders. Every industry in the world had their supply chain disrupted. And this happened simultaneously. completely unprecedented. And I think people realized once this happened that they just didn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a playbook for this kind of event happening. And they just assumed that every supply chain would continue to operate. I mean, generally when there's a disruption, it might impact one or two nodes in that global supply chain, but to have the entire world shut down simultaneously was incredible. And I think what it realized, what it drove was that it really is, industry is completely dependent on these external supply chains, not just for healthcare, but for many different kinds of materials, inputs, and services. And when they shut down, we're really stuck. And I think what this is really driven in a lot of people is the idea that we need to have a better plan for business continuity planning. We need to have a better playbook for these kinds of things. When I spoke to some of the people in the Strategic National Stockpile, for instance, they hadn't renewed their inventory of N95 masks since 2009. So their inventory literally was expired. I mean, the elastic bands were snapping on these masks. They were so old. So it really raised awareness for them as well that, hey, we've got to do a lot better job of being prepared. And likewise, every state CPO that I spoke with really did not have a good preparedness plan in place. And many of them, just were acquisition organizations. They're not thinking about carrying inventory or supplies or these kinds of things. So I think it really raised a whole level of awareness around business preparedness and preparing for different kinds of risks. And I don't think we're completely out of the woods yet. So I think it's not just about, I think, pandemic risks. It's things like cyber terrorism, energy. We saw that in Texas, last week. These are the kinds of things that I think organizations need to be prepared for. And certainly as someone in ERM, you preach that every day, Mark. So thanks.
Yeah. So when you think about, as we step back and look at what do we wish we had known, I'm hearing several themes, and it ultimately ties into people. But when I think about what you're talking about, Rob, is just that lack of that thinking about more proactive preparedness because of the reality that we're so interconnected. And that interconnectivity from a supply chain, it was more real than we realized at a global level. And then Glenn, you're talking about that interconnectivity of really the network and relationships. When you were talking about, reaching out to your bankers, reaching out to governors and people that you have an ability to talk to, how important those relationships were. And then Stephanie, you're talking about that sort of culture and how we think, and are we willing to adapt and change quickly, or are we so mired into tradition and status quo? I think one of the lessons learned is if we're stuck to the old way, we're going to be left behind if we're not careful. So, which provides, I think, a nice segue into our second lesson. And I noticed that we have some Q&A coming in, and one of those was actually a question on supply chain. So I think, Rob, you addressed that one nicely. And a couple of these others I'm going to weave in as we get into some of the other lessons. So I'll get to your Q&A as we get there. But let's move into then our second topic of sort of lessons learned. And it sort of builds on what we just talked about. And this is more about, let's focus on protecting and supporting and managing, I'm going to say your people, but your team, your people within Oracle, within Steel Fab, and then Rob, as you see how others are leading their teams. But let's think about the people side of your businesses and some of the lessons learned from that, because, one of the biggest challenges everyone faced was that we had to quickly move most of the organization from a on-site kind of way of doing business. And Glenn, obviously your work is so dependent on being on-site, it sounds like. But, there was a aspect that had to be moved off location, that remote working for social distancing purposes. And that had to happen like the flip of a switch. So Glenn, you're the CEO of your company. So all eyes are on you, when you think about managing the people, particularly a year ago, as you had to make that sort of quick, sudden adjustment to your business and how you did it. What were some of the biggest concerns you had in this remote working environment that everything was being pushed towards? And what were some of the hurdles you had to overcome?
Well, I'm going to dodge your question a little bit because we decided, our leadership team decided, since we were deemed essential, the majority of the states that we erected steel in, the job sites were going to remain open, and we needed our plant workers to come to work every day to fabricate steel. Our leadership team decided we as in the office people were going to come in every day. Now, once we realized that this pandemic wasn't going to be done in 30 days, we did become more flexible, and we realized to a certain extent we had a social obligation to allow our office employees to work from home if they could get their job done from home. So we relaxed it. Our IT department had done a wonderful job. They were fully prepared for people to work from home. But it was interesting. We probably, out of 400 office employees, we probably had 40 that actually wanted to work from home. The rest said, I need to be in the office to do my job effectively. All kind of reasons. Some people just preferred to be in their office and have their dual or triple monitor set up, an L-shaped desk. Some said, I have 3 kids at home that are not going to school and a dog that barks every time it's near the house, and I just cannot do my job from home. So we really have not had many people working from home. I will say on the production front, we talked to some healthcare providers, and we got as much information as we could get off the CDC websites, and we immediately implemented 6-foot distancing, staggered breaks. So we had 20 people in the break room and not 100 people in the break room. We even went as far as marking off urinals so that you had to be 6 feet apart when you were using the restroom in a men's urinal restroom type setup. We did not make it mandatory to face masks, but we recommended it. And we did the temperature screening for 90 days. And ironically, after 90 days of temp screening, when you're trying to get 200 men in a plant to start a 5 a.m. shift, that takes a lot of time. And ironically, we never tested one person's temperature that was in the fever range. So after 90 days, we abandoned that. But our knock on wood, we were very fortunate. Last count, we had 40 out of 1,000 production employees. We had 40 COVID positives. So our social distancing, the things we did to try to keep the guys safe, for the most part, have worked.
Did that require a lot of sort of communications from you to the entire workforce? I mean, were you having to go back and forth a lot, or just to get the information out there and get people comfortable with whatever choices they might need to be making?
We probably did similar to what PNC and Oracle did. We had, plant manager, executive meetings once, sometimes twice a week, at least for the first 2 months of the pandemic, where we were going through processes, best practices, lessons learned. And, because when you start to think about doing a temp screen and you got 200 workers coming at the same time, and they typically use one gate, you start to realize real quick, that could be an hour process before you get, so you have to come up with ways to get the people screened and get them to work a little faster. So yeah, we really over communicated the first 8 to 12 weeks of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. So Stephanie, Oracle's a global company. So can you give us a little bit of perspective about some of the difficulties that were prevalent, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, for the size organization that is, having to deal with this in multiple jurisdictions outside the United States? So can you give us a sense for what that felt like as an Oracle team member?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Very, very different experience, than the conditions that Glenn was describing in terms of how we were trying to support not only Oracle employees but our clients as well. So, when you're in a global organization, a tech organization, there's a certain amount of the way that we work that is already pre-inclined to be distributed. I work with people around the globe that I've never met in person for many years, and that's kind of a natural and organic way of working. But in addition to doing things like partnering with Zoom, for example, so Zoom runs on Oracle Cloud technology, 8x8, another video platform. These collaboration tools were something that we did have to invest some more time in, because we still do have people that are out supporting our clients on site with our clients. So Oracle itself, as a global organization, we had to pay attention to what was happening, not just in the United States, but in all of the countries where we have teams, and everybody was impacted differently. They were impacted in different ways, not only because of what was happening with the pandemic, but the laws and regulations being different in the different countries. So Oracle went to a completely remote working scenario for all of our teams. There are things that we typically do with our clients that we had to look at differently, like whiteboarding. It seems something simple, but being able to sketch on a whiteboard together in person, and doing workshopping together where you're putting Post-it notes up and kind of collaborating around what strategy looks like. And although I think digital tools have obviously come a really long way, there's something very tactile that's missing, and kind of the in-person experience that is missing. So one of the things that I think was a real challenge at first was getting people comfortable with using some of these replacement collaboration tools. Getting people comfortable with kind of logging into an application and drawing on a screen digitally instead of doing it in person with a marker. And it's not just our Oracle employees that we have to get comfortable with those technologies, but it's our clients, whoever we're working with may not be technically savvy themselves. And so there was a lot of education and patience in terms of getting those collaboration tools up and running. The other thing that I think about is one of the very last in-person meetings that I had was with GE Healthcare. And it was about a year ago now. And we had an in-person meeting, and it was just kind of turning the corner when they were trying to figure out, what do we do with, they're developing the respirators. And it's not just the technology conversations that we were having, but it was, how do we make sure that our technicians can get in to service this equipment? So there's all of these in-person angles to the conversation, even when you're in a technology discussion, that people kind of forget about. For Oracle, we have in-person scenarios like servicing the servers. The cloud doesn't actually live in the cloud. It's physical devices. And so people still do need to get in and touch and feel those devices. So, managing with safety and thinking about the humans that are involved in those scenarios was a big and important factor for both Oracle and our clients.
Yeah. And Rob, the supply chain, you touched on it a minute ago, just this network of so many players that are global. Given all the different players, it just seems like disruption because of this remote environment we suddenly were in almost had an exponential impact on businesses, because there's so many connected players, and all of a sudden that's a disrupted process. How did that sudden work from home, what was your observation for the impact on the supply chain?
Oh, there were massive impacts. One of the things that a lot of people didn't realize was Wuhan was not only the center of the COVID pandemic where it started, but it's also the epicenter of the healthcare PPE production center. So when Wuhan was shut down, it essentially shut down a lot of the production when people couldn't work from home. We also saw this huge ripple effect as people started to work from home. When I was speaking with a lot of the state CPOs, many of these states had never, had a work from home policy. People had always worked from the office. So people were literally grabbing their computers and taking them home and trying to figure out how to get these people set up to work from home was a real challenge. Some of them had e-procurement systems, others did not. So then the whole issue of how do you continue to run the state and run the facilities of the state when you rely on these third-party contractors through non e-procurement, manual kinds of systems became very challenging. We also saw it ripple across, the food sector. One of the things that people don't realize is the food distribution sector is kind of 50% retail, 50% commercial. Well, when everyone went to home and wasn't eating at restaurants anymore, all of that demand shifted to a retail sector. Mm-hmm. So the commercial distribution sector really wasn't able to react very well and start distributing, in these smaller quantities to the retail area. And that resulted in a lot of shortages. You saw this at first for food, for a lot of the proteins. So there were really these massive ripple effects that no one could ever have predicted. One of the things I think that is going to be important going forward as people return back to work, however, is testing. Right now, we've seen a big drop in testing, and that's a little bit concerning. We're currently working on a big study funded by NIST, and one of our recommendations is that we start doing more surveillance testing using antigen testing. And I think there's plans that we've looked at to help to reopen schools, reopen businesses, and it will require ongoing continued testing. And that's something that I think we should be thinking about going forward.
Yeah, so when I think about lessons related to people, one of the things I'm hearing is we are still a very people-dependent economy. That obviously in the steel industry, we got to get people to erect it. But Stephanie, even the technology space where we're so integrated with technology, there's still a people dimension to that in the design phase and then in the servicing phase. And then Rob, just that interconnectivity of the supplier relationships that I guess in some ways it's encouraging. We're still needed, but there's also emphasizing as we suddenly had to shift is the dependence on thinking about preparing from a technology angle to be able to do these remote kind of work. So now, we're on the verge of a year approaching in the dealing with this pandemic, and it's probably going to last a while longer, unfortunately. Stephanie, to what extent is your workforce, are you observing any kind of sense of sort of this workforce fatigue? Like, this has worked okay, but now we're a year.
Yeah, well, I can say personally, I'm very fatigued for sure. So, I think that there is a dawning realization, and I suspect we're going to see more of this, especially for information workers, that our lives had been very varied before, and now we're sitting in this same chair in front of the same screen for up to 14 hours a day, every day. And it's an extremely monotonous and tedious way of working without that human connectivity. And, I've been reading a lot about something called trauma-informed approach, because the reality is that people are having, there's sustained kind of low-grade psychological impact that this stress is causing for everybody. Things even as simple as there's a psychological ramification to being on video constantly like this. There's the feeling of being on video is the same pressure and stress as if somebody was in your personal space talking 12 inches away from your face in person, right? We wouldn't do that to a human. That would be a very bizarre experience, but it's the same impact as being on video all day has on your brain. So this kind of fatigue, I think, is a very real thing that organizations need to start adapting for and planning for. Some of the things that we've been recommending and I've been doing within my own organization at Oracle is ensuring that you take breaks, that you walk away from the computer. I mean, these seem common, but people don't do them often enough. The other thing is realizing that you can still just make a phone call. It doesn't have to be a video meeting. You can still just talk on the phone and accomplish your same goals together. I think some of the other things around fatigue is going to be, how do we make sure that we are creating interactivity in ways that are novel? How are we doing things like Rob was mentioning testing? I think is a really interesting and important thing too, is that in order to get to a place where we can safely kind of shift some of those normal activities back. Oracle has built, we have human capital management application software. And one of the things that we've been doing is building new facilities into the HCM software so that you can understand your employee population and what, if they've been tested, have they been tested that day? Are they safe to go into the office? What about the vaccination? Can we do tracking of the vaccination with kind of a passport system and the database that's going to be necessary? So all of those things that are going to go into helping us overcome not just the fatigue, but get back to some of the activities that kind of economically will open up what normal looks like again.
Lynn, I'm going to ask you the same question. To what extent are you sort of sensing this workforce fatigue as you think about your workforce? Of course, you mentioned a lot of them are back into the normal office, but that office looks very different today than it did pre-pandemic. What are you observing?
Well, I certainly appreciate Stephanie's comments, because I do think there becomes this tendency of every time you're going to have a conference call, you got to do a Zoom evite. And there's really no reason to do Zoom evites every time you're having a meeting. And so I'm going to take that practice back to our people. But I would say our people are probably more worn out because of all of the contact tracing. So what happens, especially to our production people, we roll into January, there's this second wave due to the holidays. More and more people are testing positive to COVID. There's more and more of this contact tracing where Johnny was close to somebody who tested positive from COVID, so he's got to stay home for 10 days, which for us meant we were having a hard time getting our people to get to work. We were having huge absentee rates in January. It's leveled off a little bit. I'm really excited that we are partnering with Atrium Atrium Health to actually come in and vaccinate all of our production workers and then all of our office workers. And we're hoping to have that done by the end of March. They were, I called them up. They were very receptive. My concern was very simple. You have production workers. Most of them are married. Most of their spouses work. They're working 50 to 55-hour weeks. Are they really going to hover on the CDC website hoping that they can, that their name gets called up to sign up for a vaccine? Probably not. And much to my amazement, Atrium was receptive. They said, yeah, we get it. We think that's a huge risk. And we want to make this easy for your people, and we will come to you and vaccinate your workforce since y'all are deemed essential. You are a supplier of steel products for Atrium Health, and it's just a matter of waiting for the vaccines to come in.
And Rob, I know you're doing some work in the vaccine sort of distributions. Any takeaways that you have, as a lot of companies are thinking about they're bringing people back, is dependent on the workforce being vaccinated? Anything that you can share from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think vaccines are certainly promising right now, and I think we need to really be sure to vaccine people, also vaccine the vaccinators, and we also need to be vaccinating the people like the janitorial staff, the maintenance staff. I mean, those are people who actually have to be in the building, and we need to pay attention to those people who are working in the facilities as well, to vaccinate them. I would say, getting a vaccine shot, a single shot, is not a cure-all. We need to continue to be careful. We need to continue to mask, continue to social distance, continue to testing. I think we're in this, unfortunately, for the long haul. This isn't a short-term fix until the entire population is vaccinated. I predict, at least for the rest of this year, we're going to have to continue to maintain those measures advocated by the CDC around social distancing, mask wearing, and testing. So I don't think it's time to start celebrating yet, that we're back to normal. We're going to be in this for a little while yet.
Yeah.
Mark, I wanted to add too, I think where our people got the most fatigued is the working moms and those kids not being able to go to school. When you really started talking to the working moms, and if you had both spouses working and the kids were not in school, you just realized, how do they get through the week?
Mhm.
And so the sooner we can get the kids back in school, the better. And the educational destruction that's occurred, not only K through 12, but in the college ranks as well, I think is just, the statistics will start to come out. But one stat I recently read was that the normal rate of failing for a first through 12th grade student is 8%. And that's going to double this year. They're saying, they're pretty convinced it's going to be 16% this year.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes my wife and I talk about, oh, it's so hard. And then we look at our neighbors that have younger children. Ours are all grown. I'm like, oh, we got it easy. We got it easy. Let's move on to our next lesson. So that was lesson 2 that we just covered on just the impact of people and thinking from a people dimension. What are some of the lessons there? I want to shift it now to think about what are some of the lessons related to the products and services that we deliver. Obviously, the mandate to socially distance meant organizations had to rethink how they deliver their product and services, and that included NC State. We totally had to flip in a week to an online environment from an in-class kind of perspective. So, Stephanie, organizations like Oracle that are pretty, digitally savvy. You're in the technology space. Most digitally savvy entities, fared pretty well because of that already being in a digital kind of mindset and how you operate, but it still had an impact on businesses like Oracle. So what lessons do you think all companies, whether they're digitally savvy or not, could glean from how they position their products and services so they can be more resilient in the future when sudden things happen? Any perspectives of thinking about how to be better prepared for the next huge disruption?
Yeah, so, and I mentioned a little bit about some of the things that Oracle has been doing even for our own products is looking at how do we roll in some of the capabilities and the things that organizations are going to need in order to be able to watch for, employee testing, to watch for vaccinations, the things that are going to be necessary for thinking differently about tracking even and tracing what's happening with your employee populations. I think as businesses are looking at how do they make sure that they are accelerating their digitization, one of the things that I've noticed is that people keep these backlogs, like these lists of things that are on their priority list, but they never actually prioritize, right? These are all the things I wish we had time to get to. We're distracted by our day-to-day business and tactical demands, and so we're not strategically shifting our business. They're the things that get discussed at board meetings, but then put on the back burner for let's look at it in next year's budget. So what I would say is that this has been a really interesting kind of forcing function, is that we talk a lot about, ultimately, no matter what business you're in, every company is a technology company, right? There's no business today that doesn't have technology kind of at the heart of what they're doing and what they're delivering. And this is, kind of ironically, a very human kind of event. A pandemic is what has made that feeling that every company is a tech company become really a very real sentiment. So I would say as companies are looking at how do they get themselves prepared to be a more digital organization, how do they look at delivering their products in a different way, is take a look at all of those initiatives that you've had on the back burner, all of the things on your backlog. In most cases, the companies that we're working with, they already have these plans. They know what they need to be doing. They're just not prioritizing doing it. They're letting the tactics and kind of yesterday's innovations and tomorrow's retirees drive their business forward instead of thinking about how do they shift and become more nimble. There's some examples of things like even the education system we were just talking about, right? They're forced into thinking about how to shift to a digital world much more differently. And a lot of that's not going to go away, right? These are changes that will stick around. So thinking about how you deliver value to your clients, who is your client base, taking a persona-based approach to understanding, who are you really delivering to? Who's your buyer? Who's your audience? How can you reach them where they're at? How can you get to them at their home desk, in their home office? How can you deliver value in a way that can be digitally delivered? advisory companies even shifting their mentality so that it's not in-person contact anymore, but still building relationships. So I think that there's, you can take even simple things like movie theaters and shifting to streaming services and look at the way that content is being delivered. So I would say it's a big lesson in reprioritizing the stuff that you already know is really critical for your business and accelerating those changes.
Yeah, so the knowledge is there. It's just action. And I would add too, there's also knowledge from this past year of how we've had to provide services differently. I know we've learned a lot about online delivery and education that we ought to capture and take forward as well. So very, very helpful. Glenn, your product is different than Stephanie's. Stephanie's is more of a technology in the cloud. Yours is tangible steel. But still, when you think about lessons learned from this past year, what do you see as some of the biggest sort of challenges affected how you could deliver that tangible product in an environment that we've been in? And then what do you think might be changes that will stay with your company going forward post-pandemic?
Well, I'll tell an interesting story that happened early on in the pandemic when I was calling everybody at a high level position that I could think of to beg them to not shut down commercial job sites. I used the example of what the governor of the state of Pennsylvania did. There was a 4-page, this touches on how complex supply chain is. There was a 4-page document that the governor issued out. It covered every industry in the state of Pennsylvania. And that governor shut down things like the textile industry. So you're sitting there going, this is incredible. Every hospital in the United States is short of these face masks, they're short of shields, they're short of hand sanitizer. They're running out of toilet paper and paper towels. And this governor shuts down textiles. And then the governor shuts down all of the car dealerships. Well, all those people going to the hospital to save those people who have COVID have to get to the hospital somehow. So you shut down the dealerships. How are they going to get their cars repaired? And then this one really surprised me. He shut down the lumber industry. And so, okay, you're going to shut down residential construction. Got it. Maybe you can do without building houses for a few weeks or months, whatever. What people didn't understand, I had a good buddy who had a lumber operation, and their biggest client wasn't home builders and it wasn't Lowe's, it was large poultry plants. So the chicken producers across the United States need wood chips for the chickens to basically live in, and it keeps things sanitized. And so it was pretty simple. You shut down lumber, and then you're going to shut down effectively the chicken industry. So, to your point, what can we anticipate to avoid supply chain disruption in another pandemic? You can't shut industry down. You just can't. And, I attribute a lot of the success that we had in getting to Governor Cooper in conversations I had with Gene Woods, who is the CEO of Atrium Health. And, Gene was on the phone with the governor every day. And you clearly figured out Governor Cooper was under unbelievable pressure by the healthcare providers to shut industry down. And I think he was listening to the healthcare providers. And when Gene understood, you can't shut down industry, because if you do, eventually there's going to be products that his nurses and doctors needed to save those who have COVID. I think he kind of rethought all that, and he was able to convince Governor Cooper, you can't shut everything down. Mm-hmm. I know that's probably doesn't exactly answer your question, Mark, but I do think it was relative to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and that sort of leads to Rob, and because Glenn is talking about just the interconnectivity of industries, which is, when I go back to your work in the supply chain space, how would you advise organizations to rethink how they look at that network of people they depend on from a supply perspective differently from what we've just learned, what we're learning right now? What would be a lesson for supply chain management, I guess, is the way to ask the question.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that people should be thinking about for the future for their businesses, and which we published a paper in HBR, included a link to that recently on how businesses need to prepare for the next major crisis. And one of the things we talk about is sort of awareness and responsiveness. So awareness is the extent to which you're kept abreast of different threats that might exist in your environment, how well you monitor those, and then responsiveness is a function of how good your playbook is. How well you've developed tools to monitor and manage risks, how well you understand where you're vulnerable, where your vulnerabilities are, particularly in the supply chain. And then putting in plans to communicate with those key suppliers, with those key nodes, and develop contracts with them as well to deal with those kinds of issues. What we saw here is people started claiming force majeure on some of these contracts, but it really wasn't a force majeure. It affected everyone. So when we start thinking about this, we have to be more creative in how we develop relationships with key suppliers, both upstream and downstream in our supply chains. And we have to think vertically and really horizontally. How do we partner with even our competitors to help one another when these kinds of things happen? We see this in the aircraft, in the aviation industry, where they'll keep pooled inventory of parts, if an aircraft goes down. So I think they could really lead to some innovative ways of thinking about how to improve preparedness and responsiveness and awareness for enterprises in the supply chain. We need to start having these discussions now, I believe.
So go ahead,
Mark,
Stephanie, please.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on that because I think it kind of weaves two things together from something you'd said earlier, which is just opening the door to thinking differently about what your business does and how it interacts with other businesses. Like Rob, what you just said about potentially even competitors working together. This is another kind of interesting example, but Hertz, car rental. So they've never planned to have all of their cars in at one time, right? There's a capacity planning element that is, we're going to have X number of cars out on the road at any given time. So we don't need parking facility for our entire fleet. And Oracle, who has buildings where nobody's going into the office because the offices are shut down. So we have empty parking lots. So serving our clients in a completely different way that was a completely out of the box way of thinking was offering our buildings, our Oracle facility parking lots to Hertz for overflow parking. It has nothing to do with our relationship with Hertz as a client. And, it's not a competitive relationship, but that's just one example of hundreds of stories like that I've heard, whether we're involved or just hearing about what's happening in the world around us, where our supply and demand is different in this environment than it was, in an environment a year and a half ago. So I think, that kind of flexibility, again, back to the point of being flexible, open to adapt, like, is there a market you can serve that didn't exist a year and a half ago for you, a different way of serving that market, and being really open-minded about kind of the positive part of this entire pandemic, which is a different sense of community, right? Like that we're all involved in something globally that maybe we've not experienced that kind of global connectivity before in the same way.
Yeah, and that transformation that's in your title, but that's a great example of transforming how we thinking outside the box in a whole creative way. And what I like the way you ended that about we're sort of all in this one together, which has provided a different lens on this particular challenge that we're facing. I want to transition to our fourth lesson. So we've talked about just the lessons learned, big picture, looking back, looking at people, looking at the supply chain side. And product and services. The fourth one rather, I wanted to talk about is just thinking more about operations and business resiliency. Because clearly the pandemic disrupted basically core operations for every organization to somehow, some way. And so I think what we're hearing in our ERM work is a lot of entities are rethinking how they approach business continuity planning and crisis management. And just thinking back, how can we be better prepared for the next round of whatever might emerge? So Glenn, let me turn to you and just say, what would be some of the lessons that you've been learning through this experience that would have informed you or would be helpful for others to think about as they think about being resilient and dealing with a crisis? I mean, you don't take courses. Well, I guess you can have some courses here on crisis management, but generally it's learned by experience. So what have you learned?
Yeah. Well, you got to be flexible, and you have to take the time to talk to your people and understand what they're dealing with at home. We had one lady who was our receptionist, and her children weren't even. They're in a smaller county, Lincoln County. The first 2 months of the fall, they weren't even doing virtual education. And I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "That means I, as the mom, go by the school on Monday afternoons and pick up their lessons, and I bring them back, and the kids are supposed to be able to figure this out on their own with my help. And if we have questions, we can email the teachers." So clearly I realized, I needed to be more flexible with her. She needed more time to get home and help her children. And, and then I bring up the temp screening again. While we were doing it, we thought it made sense. It was costing us a lot of money. It was difficult for everybody. And you go through 90 days of data and you're screening over 1,000 production workers every morning, and you don't have one that tests in the fever range, then maybe you just don't need to do that anymore. And so I do think flexibility is the biggest lesson I learned. What makes sense today may not make sense 60 days out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So flexibility and this ability to be agile. I'm seeing a question and people are asking, what skill sets do we want to take away from the pandemic? And I would say you've answered that. We've all been answering that, but that word flexibility and what Stephanie, you talked about, that ability to adjust and turn on a dime are some of those skills. Rob, to what extent, when you think back to a year ago, did you think or observe with entities, did they have the pandemic really on their radar as a real potential event?
They did not, clearly. I think it was really a terrible response that everyone had. And part of it was that, we essentially shut down our global supply chains. And what has become increasingly clear is that we are part of these global supply chains. And we're seeing this today with shortages of critical materials like semiconductors and others. And so I think we have to think a little more globally as a global community. And we're not, it's easy to say, well, we're going to put in the DPA and we're going to take care of the United States, but supply chains don't operate that way. They really are global. And if we start saying that we're going to restrict all of the components required to manufacture the vaccine, well, a lot of those components come from other countries. So does that mean they're going to stop exporting to us? So I think it has really expanded people's view of the importance of these global supply chains. And I think it also forces the issue of we need to think about how to work with other countries, work with other suppliers in different parts of the world, and come to agreements that can help all of us. This vaccine is a cure-all if we all take it, and it's going to continue to transform. So from a global perspective, I think it means we have to really start thinking about how to work with other countries more collaboratively to make sure that we have the components and the parts that we need to combat this pandemic. And every business needs to be contributing to that thought process as well.
Yeah. Stephanie, I took a look at your LinkedIn bio, and in that I picked up some of your experiences, building high performing teams and compelling storytelling platforms. And in your opinion, from your experience in leading people, really just more broadly, what makes it difficult, in your view, for business leaders to sort of engage in the discussion of what, like a pandemic a year ago, was viewed as a very low probability event. That's just not going to happen. That story doesn't sell, and people don't really want to spend the time thinking about it. What do you think are some of those challenges of getting people to believe what seems to be hard to believe and thinking about the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I think that this is ultimately what the entire insurance business is built on, is what you just described, is, the management of risk, so that I don't actually have to plan for the details of that thing happening. I can just rely upon offsetting my risk, right? And a lot of, in a technology perspective, a lot of that is about disaster recovery, from a kind of a geeky perspective for a second, these things that we're relying on, I mean, seriously relying on digitally now, what happens if they go down, right? Are you in a situation where you have your technology set up so that it can fail over to another server and it's not even noticeable, for a millisecond to the user that's sitting at the other end of the screen? So this is the kind of stuff that if you're not in a technology discussion, you are the recipient of a good technology strategy, but you are the victim of a bad one. And so, you've got to actually spend the time thinking about the elements of what a disaster could look like from a tech perspective, having good disaster recovery plans, having failover plans in your strategy. From a kind of cultural perspective, I think that getting people over that hump is sort of related a little bit to what I was saying earlier around, prioritizing your backlog. You do know the things that you need to be doing, but you have to prioritize them. Even if it seems like an edge case that's out there, you can kind of find the Venn diagram of what are the things that I need to change that would serve me in this edge case, but would also serve me in the common 80% use cases that I know are likely to happen, right? So you don't have to plan for the furthest out, let's not build a storeroom just for toilet paper in case we need it in the future, but it doesn't hurt to have a few extra rolls on hand, right? There's like a balance to those kinds of conversations that's an important perspective, I think.
Thank you. And I'm looking at our time. We have about 10 more minutes, a little under 10 minutes left. So let me transition to our last lesson, lesson number 5. And we have a couple of questions on this. So this will touch on some of the Q&A that's coming in. Is this concept of moving to the next, quote, new normal? We can't wait for the pandemic to end. And I think a lot of times we think that means we'll go back to what we used to do. But I think a lot of people are saying is, no, we're going to go back to something new. It's going to be different. And Glenn, I'm going to turn to you and just say, what advice would you provide other business leaders about how they need to be thinking about the future in a post-pandemic world? What are you doing to help your leadership team think about what that new normal is going to be?
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about, are the big companies, the Oracles of the world, are the PNCs, Bank of America, are they going to become more flexible with their people and allow them to work from home permanently? And which clearly is going to have a major impact on one of our biggest markets, which is office building construction. And I've talked to a number of people. Probably the most interesting conversation I've had on that front is a conversation I had with an executive with Amazon. And he said, I believe within the next 5 years, our office footprint will be 50% less per capita than it is today. Now, we're going to keep building offices because we're going to keep growing. We're at 800,000 employees today. We should be at 1 million by next year. But what we are seeing is a software engineer making $80,000 a year. He or she can't live where they want to live in Seattle, but they can have a really nice lifestyle off $80,000 a year living in a small town in Idaho. And so what we're doing is we're going to a office hotel format where our engineers can work from home. And when they need to be in the office for 2 or 3 days, they can check out an office for 2 or 3 days. And he said, I really believe that will be the way of the future. It will enable us to continue attracting talent, and people will get that work-life balance that they're after. I think ultimately it will depend on the industry. You know, I think construction related industry, because your superintendents and your field people have to go into the office, you have to go to the job site every day. I don't think that will become a trend as much in construction, except maybe in cities like Atlanta or Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York, where traffic is such an issue.
Mhm.
So, you know, that's where we're really trying to figure this thing out. Is the new normal half the people working from home, 40% of people working from home, or does it just immediately within the next 2 years, everybody go back to the office? I will say this, I do think some really good things are coming out of it from my perspective. And that used to be, you know, we'd have a client say, I need you to get to Tampa tomorrow for an hour and a half meeting about change orders. And now they're realizing we can accomplish everything we needed to accomplish on a Zoom call, and it saves their suppliers a day of travel.
Mhm.
I think that will be here to stay. And that's a really good thing for all of us.
Yeah. Stephanie, with your innovation and transformation sort of perspective, what do you see as sort of the permanent changes that we'll see in a post-pandemic world?
Well, I think some of them we've sort of accelerated our path to the future, like really silly, simple things like if anyone has gone to a restaurant, perhaps now you've seen that QR codes instead of paper menus, right? I mean, there's no reason we couldn't have done that in the past, but think about the implications of that. So, fewer trees cut down, less touching and exchanging regardless of COVID, just not necessary paper menus. A restaurant being able to update their menus at the drop of a hat. One ingredient doesn't arrive in the kitchen, they can change their menu instantly online digitally instead of having to reprint. So those kinds of changes, I think, are things that we're going to see persist. As far as the way that changes all of our working habits, I think, I agree with what Glenn was saying. I think we're going to see a lot more hoteling concepts like shared usage spaces and the ways of having people drop in only value-based and on demand as needed. I think some of the other shifts for, those of us in jobs and in roles that involved a lot of travel, I don't think I'm going to be flying to another country for a 2-hour meeting and turning around and flying back again anytime soon. So I think the parameters and tolerance level for travel is going to change. I think it's going to open back up, but for much more meaningful in-person interactions versus the, take a 6-hour flight for a 1-hour meeting kinds of events.
Yeah. Let me circle back for the benefit of Rob and me. Rob and I teach classes. We deal with the next generation of people sitting in your shoes. So Glenn, if you had any thoughts you'd like to share with students of today who are, early, beginning their careers soon, what would be something you would provide if you were given advice in a classroom this morning?
When they get that first job, get in the office. Do not volunteer to work from home, because you're just, that those first 3 or 4 years are so critical to your learning, your skill, your trade, whatever your career. And I'm just convinced what's happened in the K through 12 and the college ranks will and is happening with young people in their first year out of school, in their first year in their job. They're not learning as well and as fast virtually as they would be in person. So that's an easy one. Get in the office, spend as much face time as you can with your colleagues and learn everything you can. You're going to learn more. You're going to learn more effectively if you're live versus hiding behind a computer.
Okay, good. Stephanie, how about you? Any words of wisdom for the next generation students?
I would say, I think for the next generation, I would do as much kind of cross training as possible. In other words, find things that interest you and cross pollinate, right? Like learn about, if you're interested in running something in technology, learn about something in the arts, get deep in the different disciplines so that you can cross pollinate ideas. So much of what I see happening kind of out of this forced digital transformation is coming from people learning from different industries. You know, insurance, we were talking about earlier, what can you take from retail that they've learned about personalized checkout to now apply to quoting processes for insurance policies. So I would say, you know, kind of, if you are interested in something, learn about it, because chances are that you'll find a way for that to apply in kind of some novel or innovative way in your business in the future.
Rob, what are some of the messages you're already trying to give to our next generation as you think about just what you're seeing and dealing with right now?
Well, you know, I think, you know, this generation of students is entering in a very different work world. I agree with Glenn's comment. I think it's going to be really a hybrid work environment. You'll be able to work from home and be in the office. I do agree that I think it's really important to work on your communication skills. You know, communication now through Zoom and everything else is really imperative. You need to learn things like, how do you run a meeting? You know, how do you run a good meeting? How do you you know, develop a negotiation plan? How do you develop, you know, effective communication skills and ways to communicate information, analytics in a concise visual way that gets your point across? How do you influence people? You know, those are the kinds of soft skills that I think are going to become even more important in this environment today. And the only way you learn those things is through practice. You know, one of the things that we do with our students is we put them through these projects and practicums, as you know, Mark, and there's no better way for students to learn than by being mentored by other executives who can help them learn these really critical skills. So I would advocate practice those as much as possible and be willing to listen, ask people for their advice. And if they're critical, don't take it personally. Look at it as an opportunity to improve, and we can all improve on these things. So learn from it is what I'm saying.
Well, you know, we've tackled a complex topic and tried to do it in about an hour and 15 minutes, and there are more things that we could be talking about, but I do want to respect everybody's time and just to say thank you again for this awesome conversation. Glenn, Stephanie, and Rob, I very much appreciate your willingness to join in and participate as a panelist, but also just to provide your perspectives. What we've tried to do for the participants is just lay out some conversation that hopefully will tease out some lessons that we're all learning from this experience. So hopefully we can move from it with more wisdom and practice and experience. And so I'll recap the lessons that we tried to cover today is just, you know, what do we wish we had known a year ago? I would encourage all of us to think about that. I need to think about that, because I don't want to move so quickly to the next new thing, or when we get out of this, and not really take time to really think about what is it I could do and know better for the next one. I think the second lesson is just the importance of our people. That came through, I think, so much of our topics. It wasn't just that topic, but I just heard a real emphasis on the importance of people and really connecting with them, both people within the organization, but our suppliers. And then Glenn, you talked about broadly, you know, when we talk about governors and trying to get people that connecting and talking, getting the information flow going is pretty critical. The third lesson is just being able to anticipate, hopefully, and being more agile as we think about how we deliver products and services. And we've been forced to deliver products and services in ways we didn't before the pandemic in a very large scale way. Now we're doing it full steam. And what might stay post-pandemic, and then that importance of really taking advantage of technology and looking at how can we deliver things more digitally in the future. The fourth lesson was dealing with just resiliency, operational preparedness, crisis management, and just thinking back, what have we done to manage the crisis, and are some of those things providing benefits that I really want to keep on as I move forward? You know, there are things that we're doing to deal with the pandemic that maybe I want to preserve post-pandemic as far as how I lead teams and communicate within my organization. And then finally, realizing that we're going to a new normal, not the old way, and preparing for that next normal. So I just want to say again, thank you to Glenn and Stephanie and Rob. And then I also want to say thank you to Brian and PNC for being a partner on this Thought Leadership Series. I just appreciate the time we've had today and the conversation, and just want to wish everybody a great rest of their day.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Great job.
Thanks.